What if, on the other hand, we deny the antecedent? I'm abbreviating that as DA so you can remember it. AA was valid. DA is not valid. It actually will give us 0% certainty about the conclusion. Because if the antecedent is not true, then, as we'll see, the consequent may or may not be true. And we have no way to tell from that particular argument. We call this an invalid argument. It's a logical fallacy because it sounds like it's giving us some certainty about the consequent, but it's not. And let me give you an example of that. If Polly is a cat, then Polly has claws. Antecedent cat, consequent claws, because being a cat means you have claws. So if Polly is a cat, then Polly has claws. Well, I will tell you that no, Polly is not a cat. We deny the antecedent. Polly is not a cat. Does that logically prove that Polly does have claws, or does it prove that Polly does not have claws? In fact, it doesn't prove either of them. Because if Polly is not a cat, then Polly might be a fish, and in that case, it would be true that Polly does not have claws. But what if Polly is a bird? Being a bird means you're not a cat, so we deny the antecedent. But in this case, being a bird, Polly has claws. So the problem here is that there are other, having claws can be a consequent of other antecedents besides being a cat. And therefore not being a cat doesn't prove not having claws. Let me give you sort of an amusing example of that. If Albert Einstein was a dinosaur, then he had his claws under his body. Antecedent dinosaur, consequent legs under body. And that's correct. Obviously, Albert Einstein was not a dinosaur. Does that therefore prove that Albert Einstein did not have his legs under his body? Well, obviously not, because dinosaurs are not the only creatures that have their legs under their body. Another example, if Pachyrhinosaurus, our hard-nosed friend, was a sauropod, then it was a herbivore. Remember, all sauropods were herbivores, so this is true. If Pachyrhinosaurus was a sauropod, then it was a herbivore. Well, no, Pachyrhinosaurus was not a sauropod. How do you know that? Well, for one thing, you can see that there's no pubic bone pointing forwards. There is actually an ischium and a pubis both pointing backwards. You can see that there are no teeth in front of the jaw. The front of the jaw is modified to be a beak or a bill. It's got front legs that are smaller than the back legs. And all that tells you that, in fact, Pachyrhinosaurus was an ornithischian, not a Saurischian sauropod. So this argument, no, Pachyrhinosaurus was not a sauropod, you cannot conclude from that with any certainty that Pachyrhinosaurus was therefore not a herbivore. In fact, being an ornithischian, all the ornithischians were herbivores. So in fact, as we can confirm empirically from the broad, flat teeth, Pachyrhinosaurus was a herbivore, even though he was not a sauropod. So to sum up, dealing with the antecedent, there are two possibilities. If the antecedent is true, what we call affirming the antecedent, then the consequent must also be true. And that gives us 100% certainty about the consequent, and that makes this a valid argument. You have a reason to believe the consequent from the affirming the antecedent. But if we deny the antecedent, if it turns out the antecedent is false, well, then the consequent may or may not also be false. We simply don't know from that argument. And so this is an invalid argument, and we have 0% certainty about the conclusion